All right, so my name is Rachel Garber, and I live just east of Sherbrooke, Quebec, and I've been involved in equal rights movement in the United States and here in Quebec in the feminist movement, especially the World March of Women.
My name is Rina Kampeas, and currently I'm not involved with any specific activist projects. I'm still earning my living as a freelance translator from French to English. And in order to feel like I'm still reaching out into the community, I take courses at the Thomas More Institute here in Montreal, where I live, and will be doing a bit of volunteering with them. That's my current life.
So you have lived most of your life in Quebec.
That's correct.
Could you tell me a little bit about what you've observed about Quebec social movements?
Growing up, I was 17 in 1970, the year of the October crisis. So that was a period of time when I was, as were others around me, very tuned in to issues of Quebecois nationalism. One used to pick up the standard way of putting into a nutshell what the issues were for Francophones, which was that a Francophone would shop at Eaton's and the sales personnel would speak to that person in English and not be able to speak French. And I remember hearing that and thinking it through, and I thought, that's true, and feeling self-conscious and embarrassed because I was an Anglophone, and I thought what it would be like to live that. So I remember being tuned into those issues. I also remember in my Anglophone world that I grew up in, within that context, being very tuned into women's issues. I was tuned into women's issues early on in my own life and in my own reflection. And I recall encountering a lot of rage in trying to talk about those things and even bringing up issues coolly, dispassionately. You would run into rage on the part of people who weren't reflecting in a feminist way, be they male or female. On the question of language issues in the Francophone community, what I very distinctly recall, not when I was growing up, but in my early adulthood, in my 20s, is having been away from Quebec for 4 years, with visits back to Montreal from time to time, and coming back, there were really, really significant changes in legislation affirming the French fact and the French language, and in people's habits. I felt like it was really palpable that change was happening. I would never say, like I wouldn't say for the women's movement either, oh, it's all fixed. I would never say anything like that. But I just remember, because I was away when the legislation was passed, it was as though I was Rip Van Winkle coming back to see the many, many more Anglophones making the effort to master French. That, I guess I could sum it up like that.
Okay. Do any particular activities come to your mind that took place, like in either the feminist social movement or the language issue? Can you think of anything that stands out in your mind?
I was married in 1976 and had been away from Quebec for 2 years at that point, and was away from Quebec for a further 4 years. When my then husband and I returned to Quebec in 1980, there was discussion about legislation on the family being passed. And by 1981, which was when my daughter was born, by the time she was born in 1981, the legislation that related to family naming had been passed. And when I was married, I didn't change my maiden name, and I was very clear on what that, how that stood vis-a-vis the law. There was never a law that said that women had to take their husbands' names. There was no such thing. It was just a very deeply entrenched custom. But with the legislation, that it was passed in 1980 or 81, at any rate, it was in time for when my daughter was born, affirming that women had to use their birth names for various purposes, and also setting out what could be done about children's names when a couple had a child. I thought, oh my goodness, I don't have to fight the bureaucrats. Great, fabulous. And I was really very, very impressed on the progressive vision of Quebec. As far as I know, it still is, I think, the only province to have actually adopted laws around that issue. I just remember feeling good that was the kind of climate we lived in. Yeah.
Would you say that that's sort of the key date or key event for you, or is there another?
That's a good question.
Like the most important event?
You know, I guess I could say that. I wonder if maybe later I'll think back on this interview and I'll say, no, there was another key event. But I think I could say that because intuitively it surfaces so clearly in my mind. The discussion around that legislation, my following what was happening with it, and then it was adopted, it was passed, and we lived in this other climate, other ethos. And it was, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So now about your involvement personally in Quebec social movements, like what would you say that you have been most involved with in your life?
In 1980/81, around then, so very much the same juncture. It was just when I had recently moved to Lennoxville, come back to Quebec, moved to Lennoxville, Quebec, where my husband had gotten a job. I wanted to feel part of the community. I was stretching my wings. And there was a group of women who wanted to establish a center that would provide all kinds of support to English-speaking women. So a center that had women as a focus. And many of the women who wanted to establish it were feminists. Some of them were not. They didn't like being labeled feminists, which I used to find very distressing, but anyway. And specifically for English-speaking women, because with the changes in climate that I was just talking about, systemically, that had ended up disadvantaging English-speaking women, the changes in the linguistic climate.
Okay.
And they were really good changes, but systemically they disadvantaged English-speaking women. And so this need was felt by English-speaking women in the Lennoxville community. There were women who were involved with local business or Champlain College or whatever, and just wide-awake ladies or who were grassroots people from the township's community. They felt English-speaking women need a hand when they are experiencing domestic violence, when they want to access services and they don't speak French and they phone the government of Quebec. So I jumped on that. I thought that was amazing. Great project. And it wasn't me who dreamt it up, but I was in with the women who started it up. And that was the Lennoxville and District Women's Center, which is thriving to this day. And as you know, when you came to that region in the 90s, you got involved and made a huge impact on the Women's Center. That was one thing. And then over time, with my involvement with the Women's Center as a founding member and continuing member, and for many periods on the board of directors, I often served as a liaison to umbrella organizations in the area of women's groups because they functioned in French and I was proficient in French. So I was able to be the liaison between the Lennoxville and District Women's Center and Township's English-speaking women and the wider world of services to women and organizations serving women. The other thing I feel was a strong, salient community involvement or activist involvement in my memory was that I also helped to start up women's studies at Bishop's. Okay. I didn't have a regular position at Bishop's, but here and there I would pick up part-time instructor jobs. And in fact, even before I ever held such a job of being a part-time instructor, just by knowing some of the women on the campus, I got drawn into discussing curriculum for the nascent women's studies program that women at Bishop's were trying to establish. So I was already on board at that stage, and then I became a part-time instructor, so I had a little bit more of a foothold. And so I was there when we thrashed out courses to build up a women's studies concentration and taught women's studies courses. I taught the cross-disciplinary one called Introduction to Women's Studies that initiated people who were interested in that field into thinking in those terms, thinking theoretically and academically in feminist terms. So that was in the 80s, and the involvement with the Women's Center lasted through the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s. The involvement with women's studies leveled off in the early 90s.
Would you say that the feminist movement and these activities were maybe the movement that's closest to your heart, or?
I would say yes.
You've talked about your involvement in the 80s, but I wonder if you'd talk about the World March of Women.
Yeah, and I'll be very happy to. So you were significantly involved with the Women's Center at that time, Rachel, and you and I had met, and we had met because, in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, because in the late 90s you were involved in the Women's Center and I had pulled back a bit, and it was a need for new blood or revived old blood on the board of directors. And so you reached out to me based on minutes of past meetings and such. So I got involved, got to know you, which was a real delight. And then, of course, in the year 2000, I guess it was in late 1999, and then through the year 2000, there was build up towards the World March of Women, which culminated, I think, on October 16th of 2000. I was drawn into that, to planning, to recruiting for the local marches that happened in different parts of the Estrie district that both you and I lived in, and then built up to the march in New York on October 16th.
I have a memory of the march in Lennoxville itself.
Yeah.
And you were on the megaphone.
Yes. Yeah.
What was that like?
I get stressed, even for the most minor things. And so there I was on the megaphone for that particular event that day in Lennoxville. And calling out explanations to the crowd to do this and that. And then when we actually did march, I was in a car. And again, there was a device so that I could speak and everybody would hear me. And I think it all played out okay, but what I remember is being really, really wrapped up in making sure that I didn't muddle stuff, that I didn't give out confused. So that's what that was like. It should have been all lovely euphoria. Oh, this amazing event, but no. It was me being stressed about making sure that I wasn't inarticulate, stuff like that.
Oh, you were very articulate.
Thank you.
This was a movement that was really started by the Fédération des Femmes du Québec.
Yes.
So the Quebec women, Francophone women, really spearheaded it. And it spread worldwide into something like 169 countries. And, and our little part, the English-speaking women in what was then a little bilingual town of Lennoxville, next to this bigger, medium-sized city of Sherbrooke, we were really a minority within this whole big movement. Yeah. So how was that for you?
I have to admit that one aspect of that, and what I'm about to describe, was also an aspect of other components of my involvement in the women's movement during the 80s and 90s. One aspect of that struck me was that I had a strong sense of a kind of insularity on the part of Quebec, Francophone Quebec women. One felt when one was being in touch with what was happening in the wider world of Estrie or the cities you just mentioned, Sherbrooke and Lennoxville, and with Francophone women mounting this. I say insularity, and then I think how complex this is, because just as you said, it reached out to 169 countries. It was an astonishing initiative to come out of Quebec. But one had this feeling that they didn't know that the English-speaking community existed. So it wasn't only affirming their identity as Francophones, it was an odd unawareness, blindness, that there was the English-speaking community of Quebec, English-speaking women in Quebec, strong feminists, and all of Canada. So there's that thread of complexity and of division that is also wound into my lived experience of the women's movement in Quebec.
One aspect of my experience was a little bit of the bridging of that divide. Because I remember in sort of, it was almost like encounter groups leading up to the march where we would meet with representatives from other local groups. And I remember we were sharing about why we were involved. And one thing for me is, I said, I will always be from away. I will always be a foreigner wherever I go in the world. But no matter how long I live in Quebec, I will always be the other. I will never be a Quebecoise. And I remember that some of the Francophone women in the group seemed to be very touched by that.
Understood.
And they came to me and hugged me and said, "You are Quebecoise. You are." Of course, this was all in French. So.
But that's good. So much changed from when I was growing up. But go on.
But this is fine that it was all in French. But at the same time, I had to say to myself, yes, but I'm never going to be able to participate in your society, this society, on an equal footing because I just don't have the linguistic skill.
Okay, understood.
But at the same time, there was this
bridging.
You're right. Is there anything that you learned or that you felt was something that, for me, that was a moment of realization, recognition that we are all the same, really. I don't know if there's anything that sort of...
There is something. I'm not sure exactly why my memories have tended a little bit more to the negative side so far, but to be fair, there was a joint action group called in French Table de Concertation of the Office of the Status of Women, Quebec's Office of the Status of Women. And the person who staffed that office for a long time, Nicole Dorin, was very, very open to the English-speaking community. Very open, and often herself personally made the effort to speak English, worked very hard to speak English when she came to meetings by English-speaking groups like the Women's Center. And so that was under a Parti Québécois government too. So not to be simplistic.
What motivated you to get involved either in the women's movement or in the World March per se?
What motivated me to get involved in the women's movement was that it was so evident to me as I, in my early adolescence already, it was evident to me that there were contradictions in how in the world around me people talked and what they did. So we talked about fairness. I was being initiated, growing up in Montreal, going to public school, elementary school and high school. I was being initiated by the curriculum, by my teachers, by my adults around me into a world of fairness, purportedly. And I always could see the gap between that and the way women lived and were treated, that there was gross unfairness. And that motivated me to get involved in the women's movement once I was in my mid-teens and more able to have agency and to figure out what kind of activist things I wanted to do. And the World March was just an amazing, amazing initiative. It was beautiful in every way to focus on the theme of women in poverty and women in violence, very crystallized themes that matter, and to reach out to the whole world, reach out on the basis of where women all around the world could understand each other, that these oppressions were not right, and pull them all into an event on a single day in one city. What was not to like, what was not to get involved.
Considering the social movements that you've been involved with over your life in Quebec, what languages were people using when they were participants?
It was the two contexts. One context was English speaking, one context was French speaking. It was largely that, not exclusively.
Two separate contexts.
Largely it was two separate contexts. And so, for example, with my involvement with the Women's Center, meetings were conducted in English. Women's studies at Bishop's, meetings were conducted in English, largely. In a minute I'll mention something that deviated from that. And then when I was involved in liaison on behalf of the Women's Center with umbrella organizations, etc., meetings were conducted in French. Largely it was that. Broadly, the World March of Women context did include deviations from that, like on the day that we had the march in Lennoxville. And with the megaphone, I did my best to give out explanations in both English and French, and there was a mix of people there participating. And then with women's studies at Bishop's, there was once a deviation from that, in that we reached out to the University of Sherbrooke and some key feminist academics there, and we put together an application for funding for a chair that would have jointly been held by Bishop's and the University of Sherbrooke. We didn't get the funding, but we did that. We did that, and
Did that together.
we did that together. So there was a bit of deviation and there was outreach, not totally staying in our own islands. But my overall recall is of meetings in one context that were held in English, meetings in another context that were held in French.
Interesting. I get the sense there wasn't that much working together at that period of time.
There was effort. And there was some receptivity and some resistance on the part of those organizations that served the whole community.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the aspects of Quebec is that we have two minorities here. Both the linguistic majority sees itself as a minority in the wider context, and the linguistic minority obviously sees itself as a minority in the Quebec context.
Yeah.
So maybe tolerance is a little bit of a challenge for both of us.
Sure.
Courage and tolerance.
Sure. Very, very, very valid point, that you start to see how all these issues intersect in everybody. And at different moments of your life and in different contexts, you're playing out different roles. And there's always the native people to remember. And the languages of the native people don't even figure in any of this discussion. It's always English and French. Yeah.
From your perspective, is language a meaningful aspect of the history of Quebec social movements over the last 50 years? And how?
It certainly is a meaningful aspect. Good gravy, yes, of last 50 years social movements in Quebec. There's the blindingly obvious example of the assertion of the French fact and the Quiet Revolution, and then the even more overt revolution once the Parti Québécois were in office. Language was a meaningful aspect of the affirmation of French by Francophone Quebecers. There have been some overly doctrinaire aspects of that, but of course it was meaningful and positive and powerful. The language issue, I think it's absolutely true to say that it does wake one up to the whole issue of being a member of a minority group or of otherness. And it helps clarify thinking about all kinds of otherness and the need for activism on a whole range of fronts, including gender issues and including also sexual orientation issues. And
various cultural backgrounds, the whole realm of differences.
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering, in your mind, are there any nuances or differences in the feminist discourse between the Francophone context and the Anglophone context?
What I found as I was involved in the 80s, I was involved later in the 80s also, but thinking back to the 80s, that period, my unscientific take is that the Francophone women who were active on behalf of women and who came from the community at large, who weren't academics, that they had a deeper analytic grid about women's issues than the Anglophone women I knew, about whom you could say the same thing. They who'd come from the general community, they weren't academics. I found Anglophone women who would wanted to be active on behalf of women, all of that, but they seemed to me timid in their willingness to really go deep in the critique of relations between women and men. So I found Francophone women had gone farther, and it seemed that it had something to do with their education and something to do with the social democratic background. Not that that's absent in the rest of Canada. We all know it's got a huge, wonderful tradition in the rest of Canada. But there was just something a little more radical about the social democratic politics of activists in general from the Francophone community and of women in the women's movement. They were really willing to be trenchant and cut deep at the root of inequities between women and men. And then, like, as I was mentioning about the legislation that was passed in 1981, you saw that in that legislation. It was very forward looking, and that government wasn't afraid to be what many other governments or many other polities would have considered eccentric. They weren't afraid to look eccentric. They just did it around family law and family names.
You mentioned education. I'm wondering, would this what you've just described be related at all to the silent revolution and turning away from the Catholic Church?
That makes sense to me. It totally makes sense to me.
And the education in terms of the nuns. I've heard it said that the teaching nuns were secret feminists. Sort of wanted to empower the girls that they were teaching.
And of course, one has heard of many contexts in which that was the case. I think that really depends on the ethos of a particular order of nuns, because I've also heard the opposite. So it depends on the order. But yeah, that could have made a very, very big difference. And the whole impulse to move away from the domination of the Catholic Church might have given special impetus to the reaction against patriarchy. It's possible, yeah.
What would you have to say about the feminist movement today as compared to the 1980s?
I'm very reassured by the fact that lately I hear a lot of women being interviewed. Nowadays, I'm hearing many women who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who in the course of an interview, in order to explain a certain attitude to something, will say, I'm a strong feminist. And between the 80s and now, there was a period of time when feminist had turned into a dirty word. It's been reclaimed, and we're back to a perspective that I think was more widespread in the 80s than in the time in between, which is that it's not a dirty word. If you embrace feminism, you're embracing an analysis and a critique that's very productive and very helpful for society. In between, we had the backlash when there was this kind of doctrine that second wave feminism, that the feminism of the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s had been strident and blah, 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 blah.
Bra burning.
Yeah, all those silly, goofy terms that people flung around. On the other hand, there's a persisting backlash that's still out there. And what troubles me very, very much is the naturalization of violence against women, the banalization of violence against women as something that's titillating and fun in video games, in the arts, in movies. The stuff that we're contesting has grown. To me, more brutal, more crass, more threatening.
More visible too, in a sense.
More visible. Like I say, banalization, exactly, very much more visible and shameless, sort of weirdly in your face. There's a change at the grassroots level of what we're combating. And there's a kind of a greater aggressiveness in terms of opposing political correctness. So people resist what they deem to be political correctness and insist on their right to a discourse of violence against women. Mm-hmm. So where do we go from there? You know, but those are two things that I see. Yeah.
Yes. What would you say still needs to be done in terms of women's rights in Quebec?
We have to continue the process of entrenching the sense that certain social safety net measures are rights for everybody and not privileges. So I was dismayed with the current government's proposal to change daycare fee structures. And of course, daycare shouldn't be viewed only as a women's issue, but that's the whole problem. It's bound up with the status of women. I would have liked it if, as a society, we were moving even farther towards a state of affairs where daycare was seen as a universal right. I thought $7 a daycare, or $7.35 was fabulous. Again, it was an aspect of the deeply feminist and social democratic fabric of Quebec society that I am proud of. So it dismays me that there's a backwards movement on that, and it makes me feel like that overall sense of the importance of gender equity. It's not yet so deeply rooted that it can't be undone. Mm-hmm. I wish I could articulate a more specific recommendation. It's kind of like a general recommendation that I have. But in general, I think we need to keep on working on the problem of pay inequity between women and men. Yes. So exactly what needs to be done, I don't have specific suggestions, but it still exists, the pay inequity, as it does in the rest of Canada. But you know, here in our own province, we can work on it. And try to roll that back. Just keep on working towards a day when women and men will be paid the same for the same lives that they live. Yeah.
I wonder if you have any advice that you would give to social activists today.
I think my advice would be to reach for the deepest possible understanding for yourself. Reach inside yourself for the deepest understanding you can attain of the way that people are socially constructed, and of the fact that it's not helpful to construct villainies and engage with villainies or people as villains, but rather to engage with blind spots. Because at least for me, to take the other approach and to engage with villainies and villains is deeply, deeply embittering and leads to burnout. And I think the approach, the one I'm recommending, to see people as socially constructed, as most of us doing our best but having blind spots, acting on anger that we think is justified. To me, it's a more powerful account of what really is the case with human beings, and less disempowering and enraging and disabling. So that doesn't come out of any of the rest of the stuff we've talked about so far, but it's the piece of advice that I would give. Yeah.